Okay, welcome to another episode of the Doomer Optimism podcast. My name is Donald, and I'm joined today by Rita, who is a professor at the University of Houston and author of articles all over the place at the Claremont Review of Books and the Hedgehog Review, and the Point magazine. Has a book from Oxford University Press and another book on the way. Is that right?
I mean, it's in progress.
It's in progress. Okay, writing another book. And I was reminded recently of an article she wrote in 2020 for the Point magazine about homeschooling. And if you read this article, which we'll link to, it is very much a period piece from 2020, but I think speaks to timeless questions, or not quite timeless maybe, but larger questions that aren't particular to 2020 about family culture and homeschooling versus public schooling, and the how figures like Rousseau and Jean-Jacques thought about those things. What I appreciate about Rita's writing is that, unlike me, she tends to be prudent and reasonable, but without being boring, which is an excellent combination. I tend towards the irrational, so it's always nice to read her writing on things to help bring me back to reason. So, Rita, good morning. Is it okay? Could you just sort of recapitulate that piece a little bit, and set the problem of the family and the state in liberalism?
Sure. Yeah. Well, as you say, it was a period piece. Everybody wanted writing on the pandemic during the spring of the pandemic. So it was very timely for me because I had been thinking about schooling and education for a long time at that point, and had been sort of defending homeschooling a little bit. So the essay was basically a kind of sausaging of stuff I was already thinking about into the concerns of March 2020, which were that the schools were shutting down and all these people suddenly had their kids at home and they were doing online education, as you might recall, but nobody had really had a platform for that, or very few schools already had kind of an advanced way of delivering online education. So it was bad. And a lot of it was going to, very small children who were in no position to benefit from any kind of online anything. So that was doubly bad. And so parents were very upset about this. And so, I wrote a kind of defense of this moment as an interesting experiment that we're not likely to see again, because democracy tends to make homeschooling a little bit difficult, because people have to work. And they have to go make money, and democracy is kind of a regime of not very wealthy people. 1 second. All right, sorry. Korean dad moment, or rather, I guess dad was white, but his Korean kids came.
That was perfect.
So,
talking about homeschooling, then the kids run in the door. It's great.
Yeah, well, my kids are on vacation now, so they're not being schooled. They're being unschooled. Yeah, so I guess the broader theme that, before the pandemic and after the pandemic is still there is kind of the question of the status of children in liberalism. And there was actually just like the other day an article in New York Magazine, this woman arguing that conservatives who are arguing for parents' rights are treating their children as property. And that's very dangerous, because if we treat our children as property, we might abuse them. And this is a very sort of short-sighted article, nobody has ever had this thought or something. So thanks to this woman for bringing to our attention that children are not property. But we understand that children are not property. Even Locke understood children are not property, but precisely because they're not property, but they're also not autonomous, they pose kind of a dilemma, because what are we supposed to do with them? Liberalism is premised on this idea of sort of universal freedom and universal equality, but children are not free or equal. I mean, they are in theory, right? Or Locke says kind of in potentiality, but they don't get there for a long time. And it turns out that they might not just get there spontaneously either, because if we just left them to their own devices, they might never achieve the kind of rationality that's necessary to be a liberal citizen. So liberalism kind of hates authority and, sort of disparages authority, undermines authority most of the time, right? There's nobody who has kind of automatic authority in liberalism, except experts are a kind of interesting category. But, we no longer defer to the monarch, for example, as some kind of more excellent person than us, because the monarch is just a human being in the state of nature along with us. And we don't defer. I mean, it takes longer, but we don't defer to religious leaders in the same way, especially once the Catholic Church is disestablished, because Protestant pastors are not sort of automatic authorities on anything. And the churches are decentralized and they don't have this kind of hierarchical authority. And so there isn't really natural authority in liberalism. But it turns out there's a necessity for authority over children, because if you don't exercise authority over them, they will run into the street and get hit by a car, or whatever the equivalent is in the 18th century. So liberalism kind of requires us to exercise authority over children by educating them, but it doesn't really give us a foundation to do that, because authority is basically a problem for liberalism, and it's something we're trying to avoid at all times over other people who are equals. And so the question of education for a liberal democracy is kind of fraught, because who's supposed to do it? And what are they supposed to teach, right? And so for a long time, I mean, Locke and Rousseau themselves sort of didn't like schools, had some negative things to say about schools. I mean, they weren't totally opposed to them, but basically had negative thoughts about schools, thought that, schools already existed, obviously not public school systems or anything like that, but there were institutional schools in both England and France. And they thought that schools did a bad job sort of at achieving the ideal liberal result, which is that you want to be a kind of a reasonable person who is not subjected to or is not a slave to public opinion. And the problem with schooling is that it kind of forces you to be subjected to public opinion all the time in the form of your peers' opinions, which are totally irrational. And this is kind of the power of fashion, as they call it. But there's not enough adults to intercede between you and your peers. And so you end up in these sorts of relationships with other children where you're totally submissive to them because your social approval is totally dependent on them. And so they didn't like that, and they wanted to avoid that. So they recommended education at home with tutors, but ideally really with parents as the teachers. And their argument was that this is the right way to develop the child's will so that it's kind of strong and able to withstand the pressures of public opinion and fashion, and so that you can, quote unquote, think for yourself. So that was their thought, but of course it doesn't really translate to a liberal democracy, because the democratic part of it means that we are poor, and we don't have a country estate to take our children to and educate them on, because we have to go work. And so we have this question in the United States about schooling, right? It seems that we do need some kind of schooling, and there is a kind of popular movement to build schools, including public schools, very early on in the 1780s. It doesn't go anywhere. We don't really have the state capacity for it. There's a lot of opposition for it or to it. We finally get the common school movement in the 1830s and 40s in New England. It starts in New England. It moves out in the Northeast into the Midwest. And so the question of homeschooling in the United States is kind of strange, because people did de facto homeschool, obviously, for a very long time, until there was compulsory schooling. And then you had to, by law, send your kids to a institutional school. And that was fine, but the way that our historians and policymakers have interpreted that as like, well, that was a time when we were undeveloped. We didn't really mean for that to happen. It was just like there weren't enough schools. So, people had to work on the farm, and then school was too far away. They could only attend the school in winter. So obviously there was some kind of home instruction going on, but basically it was regrettable, because it was just a lack of schools that was really going on. And so once compulsory schooling becomes national in the beginning of the 20th century, homeschooling is basically illegal. And there are some exceptions, like if you're really sick and you can't attend a school, you can stay home. You can do correspondence schooling, but basically nobody does it. It's very rare for people to actually be homeschooled. And so it has to be sort of re-legalized in the 1970s, and which it is. But by the time it comes back to the United States in the 1970s and 1980s, it's like a weird countercultural movement. And it's not like the sort of normal thing that people are doing. And I think it still bears a lot of that stigma today, that like if you're homeschooled, you're not properly socialized, and you're going to be like a weirdo. So I'm sure you've heard, those kinds
So
of
I have
arguments.
two questions about this history. One, what you said about authority. So I say this all the time, but I my older daughter really loves the Laura Ingalls Wilder books
Yeah.
and Anne of Green Gables, both of which offer a really interesting view into a former age of education. Because you get a both in the Ingalls books, you definitely get uh, a view of both homeschooling and what schools looked like.
Mm-hmm.
Um, both of which are sort of remarkable. I mean, there's the scenes where they're nearly starving to death and they're reciting from memory like speeches from ancient Rome. Anyway, it's amazing. But in both instances, both at home and in the wider community and in school, there's a very strong sense of authority, of parents over children, of adults over children, of a teacher, a husband over wife, teacher over student. And this
Mm-hmm.
corresponds to a remarkable amount of freedom for the children, that they basically get the run, as long as they do their chores, they basically get the run of the place with no supervision at all. So anyway, those books have always struck me as that there's a
Yeah.
strong correlation between very clear and unquestioned authority. I mean, there's the instance where Laura has a terrible teacher who refuses to exercise authority and things go terribly wrong. But even in that case, her parents forbid her from criticizing the teacher at all. Uh,
Yeah. I mean,
so there's
so I would,
this combination of authority and freedom seems very clear.
yeah. So this is sort of what I'm working on now on American education. And I think literature is really interesting for this. Yeah, so we have this problem with authority, right? It's not in the Laura Ingalls Wilder books, but I would be careful with those books because they are not written at the time that is being described, right?
Yeah,
So they're written in the 20th century as a kind of look back onto her childhood.
with the guiding
And,
hand of Rose Wilder.
and um, oh yeah. So there's a little ideology. I mean, I was shocked. I reread them with my daughter recently. Obviously, my daughter didn't perceive that. She was in first grade, but the comments on the Indians and the comments on the government and things like that. There's like a lot of political innuendo in those books, and they're not exactly of the moment. So I love them too, by the way. But there's some ideology smuggled into them that I think is trying to present the mid 19th century frontier as more wholesome than we sort of know it was.
But they also
So
almost starved to death several. It's not all.
Oh no, no, it's not like it's beautiful and cuddly. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
life is hard, and they present the hardness of life. That's part of what she's trying to get across, I think, is how resilient these people are, right? And how they're able to survive and how like ingenious. I mean, Laura's father, like just built everything in their house from, scratch. And
Mm-hmm.
he doesn't have hinges for the door. So he like devises a system with leather straps, right? So they're very sort of ingenious and resilient and all of that. She's trying to convey their virtues, right? And in order to do that, you have to sort of depict how difficult the environment is. And they get chased off that homestead I think
Mm-hmm.
it's in Missouri, right? That's in Indian country, because they think the government is going to give it to them, but the government doesn't give it to them. So, I mean, there's a lot of sort of adverse things that happen to them in the books, but I think that what she's trying to depict is a more virtuous past to contrast with the kind of dissolute, decadent 20th century present that she sees, where people have lost this kind of self-reliance. So those books I'd be a little careful about as like true depictions of what is going on in on the frontier in the 1850s and 60s. I guess they're mostly the 70s through the 80s is when they're taking place, right? Because it's after the Civil War.
But don't you think that idea of authority was clear? I mean, I read recently John McPhee's The Headmaster, which is a book about the man whose name I forget, but who made the Deerfield Academy, the Deerfield
Okay.
Academy. In the early days, interesting, there weren't public schools there. It was a private school, but it was the local school, and he was going
Yeah.
around to farms and recruiting the young men to leave the farm and come to school, and had to sort of he had to demonstrate his own physical prowess in order to convince. There's a scene of throwing a baseball back and forth with a young man in front of a little crowd, and he's throwing it as hard as he can, and the young man's throwing it back and forth, and once he proves himself at throwing the baseball, then the young men say, okay, fine, we'll come to your school. But anyway, this
Yeah.
similar, yeah, and this is all the way into the 20th
But
century.
that doesn't suggest authority. That suggests lack of authority, that you got to like
Well,
prove that.
but once they're in the school, anyway, yeah, he comes when he takes over the school, it's sort of in shambles, and he has to rebuild it. But he exercises anyway. I think that it seems like in that there, I'm not disagreeing with you about that there's an undermining of authority. Like the idea of authority now seems totally anathema to basically everything in the culture. But it fairly recently in the past, that doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little complicated. So, I mean, if you want to look at a different book, um, Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn,
Mm-hmm.
not a lot of built authority. So, I mean, if you look at stuff from the 19th century, and this is Tocqueville describes this, I think, really well in Democracy in America, where he talks about the relationships of the family. And he says, it's not like the aristocratic family. There's no automatic deference. Right. And so it's not, he says, it's not that there isn't authority, but the basis of it is very different. It's like this kind of intimate affection that you develop for your parents by living with them, and not because they wield some kind of power over you that comes to them from the outside of your family, right? Like the state, they have this inheritance that they can bestow upon you or choose not to bestow upon you, right? Unless you please them, or that the state has invested them with a certain kind of power. That doesn't really happen in the United States. And so, the family, the democratic family that Tocqueville describes, is a fairly stable family in a certain sense. Like it's not what we would think of in the late 20th century, right? Where there's like a high divorce rate and families are sort of fractured. But it's really grounded in something totally different than traditional European authority structures. And I think that's kind of borne out in a lot of literature from the 19th century. Like you get a lot of deference to fathers, especially in New England. But it's not like, you read Tolstoy and they like refer to their parents by formal names. Right. So everyone just calls their parents like whatever the momentary equivalent of mom and dad is, mother and father, which is not really a formal name. And they don't call them sir, for example, which would be the European way of addressing your father, or that's very uncommon in America. So I think that we have to say there probably was not in America a real golden age of authority on the aristocratic model that we've inherited from Europe. And that doesn't mean it was unstable, but it certainly means that it had this potential for instability, which I think Tocqueville saw. It's not long lasting is the real problem. And it's not multi-generational. So like your family just ends and then you have your children, and there isn't this kind of multi-generational inheritance where you see yourself as part of a long line of people in your family and you're carrying out their legacy. And as Tocqueville says, like, the aristocrat can imagine his great-grandchildren and like they're real to him. I don't think there's anybody in America who has ever given a single thought to their great-grandchildren, right? Maybe if you're really family-oriented, you can imagine the idea of having grandchildren one day, right? I think most people imagine children if they imagine anything. But like to go 3 generations into the future, I think is just beyond the comprehension of most Americans. You just do not imagine that. So that model of authority, I think, is not here, never present in the United States. It makes authority more complicated for us because if the child is not property, which we understand the child is not really property. It's not property in the law. It's not property even in our imaginations, but it's a kind of trust, right? Because it's totally dependent. Whatever it is, it's a dependent thing that we don't own, that we try to develop for its own good, right? Not necessarily for our good, although we might derive some benefit from doing it, right? But that's not the ultimate purpose of educating your children. Well, why should parents get to do it? That becomes the big dilemma sort of in the 20th century, right? What is the special right of parents that allows them to have this kind of control over education versus the society? Doesn't the society have some kind of say in how your children are educated because it has an interest in how they turn out? And so that's when you start to get these questions about like, well, what's the role of the state? And the state is just kind of floats in because there's nothing else, right? It's like if it, society doesn't really have any agency. So we're talking about society, but society doesn't act. The state can act though.
I guess
And so then you get this kind of conflict.
Catholic education is an interesting and in America controversial third option. That in a
What do you
lot of
mean?
ways public schooling is a response. Some ways public schooling is a response to the dangers of Catholic education. That Catholic children being educated by the church in Catholic schools are not being and made part of American Protestant civilization and so on, are set apart and are under the authority of bishops.
Yeah, so that it actually starts with common schools. Catholic schools are kind of a response, and then the common schools fight back. So the original common school curriculum is very Protestant. Horace Mann is, it's like sort of infused with Protestantism. It's not like really meant to be discriminatory, I think, in an aggressive way, but that's the dominant mindset of New England and the Northeast. And then you get this Irish Catholic immigration into the Northeast, and they're opposed to the common schools because they see them as basically not non-sectarian, but Protestant non-sectarian. And so then they develop the parochial school system in the cities in the Northeast as a kind of alternative to that. And then that's what creates the sort of question about, well, are these children really being educated in a way that's going to make them Republican citizens? Yeah, so the question comes up quite early. I mean, in the 1880s, 1870s, and 1880s is when you get these conflicts. And the people who make the common school system understand themselves as carrying out the kind of, they don't see it as the state. People don't talk about the state in the 19th century. They talk about the nation, the republic, right? It has like a kind of more noble sounding purpose than the state. And so their view is that we need a certain kind of citizen. I mean, a lot of these people are Whigs, in the 1840s and 1850s. We need a certain kind of citizen who's going to be able to be responsible, who's going to be able to be sort of self-controlled, who's going to be virtuous. And it's not enough to leave it to parents to cultivate this because it's unreliable, right? Some parents will and some parents won't. And so we don't know in a way, we have to centralize that because we can't just allow 100 different kinds of school systems to exist and assume that they are going to sort of aim at that end, right? And plus there's a kind of anti-Catholic prejudice that it's all a conspiracy anyway, especially among Protestants. And so of course they're not pursuing the end of republicanism because they're pursuing the end of, what is it? Popism, what do they call it? The ends of the papacy. Let's put it that way. No, they have a much more
How do you
derogatory term for it.
understand the rise in homeschooling? So the homeschool movement that led to changing laws in the 70s and 80s, as you say, it tended to be very religious. People had their kids taken away from them, would be jailed. It was a really contentious thing. Now, decades later, it's more normal, way more normal. Like I'm in the sort of part of the homeschool thing here. My older daughter's only 6, so people always say like, "Oh, what are you doing for homeschooling?" I say she's 6, like I don't know, she does some stuff, but I'm not too worried. Like, I don't even think schooling should start at 6. So, but we're connected to that here, and I'm always struck by how non-ideological other homeschool families are at this point. That it's a big range. It's a big range, and it's just a pretty non-controversial thing in Northwest Washington anyway. I know in New England it still there's some states in New England that have much more difficult homeschool laws versus there's states like Idaho
homeschool laws
and
are kind of spread out. Yeah,
there's states like Tennessee and Idaho where you don't even have to register a student. Like in the state of Washington, we had to send starting at age 8, send a letter every year to the school district saying we're homeschooling this year. and that's it. That's the full extent of what's required.
Yeah.
And even that, you know, within the homeschool movement is seen as a terrible imposition. The state has attempted several times, or one of the legislatures, to lower the age from 8 to 6 for mandatory homeschool reporting, and the homeschool lobby has defeated this every time.
Yeah.
But I'm
Homeschool
curious how
lobby is
you
really powerful.
understand this, because it seems to move in the opposite direction of many other things in American culture, of kind of increasing state control and
Normalization.
surveillance. But
Oh, I
then on
see.
the other hand, you have the homeschooling, which is, and especially in the last couple of years, has apparently just exploded in size. And yeah, I'm curious how you make sense of that.
Well, I think you have to first think that the beginning of homeschooling is caricatured as being all these fundamentalist Christians, but it's actually a coalition. It's like a very strange bedfellows coalition of hippies, left-wing hippies,
Mhm.
and religious conservatives. And the left-wing hippies, their objection to institutional schooling is like what Ivana Leach writes about, right? That the school is like a factory and it's like turning their kids into sausages, and they want their children to be free and to explore and all of this stuff, and so they want to pull them out of this kind of factory model of education. So it's a lot of people who are influenced by Leach, by John Holt, by these other writers in the 60s and 70s. And so they're one side of homeschooling, and like I mean, they're not always in favor of some kind of other structured curriculum. They just want to get away from structure. And then you have these religious Christians. I mean, you can call them fundamentalists. Some of them call themselves fundamentalists, but mostly they don't, who are opposed to what they see as the secular humanism, the sort of secret religion of public schools, which is kind of analogous to what we were talking about with the Catholics and the Protestant common schools, right? The common schools didn't see themselves as Protestant, but to the Catholics, they looked Protestant, or at least sectarian. And so a lot of these Christians viewed the sort of neutral, non-religious education of the public school as actually inculcating a religion, right? A kind of religion of secular humanism, which undermined their own religious belief. And so they wanted to pull their kids out of the schools because they thought that schools were basically turning their kids into atheists. And they kind of formed this strange legal coalition to argue for this right to pull their kids out of school and provide them with this alternative education at home. They were very much abetted by the decision in Wisconsin v. Yoder in 1972, which allowed the Amish this exemption from the compulsory school laws. I'm not supposed to call it an exemption, according to my husband, who's a lawyer, because he says there's no exemptions. It's just the law was not constitutional. But effectually was an exemption. And then other people start to ask for this kind of religious-based exemption. And that's why religious homeschooling has become sort of the paradigm of homeschooling, because Wisconsin v. Yoder allowed people to get religious exemptions, but it didn't allow them to get like ideological exemptions, which is what the hippies basically would have wanted. And it specifically says, like the decision, Justice Berger says, like, we're not here to like give Thoreau an exemption from compulsory schooling because he like wants to sit in Walden Pond, right? It has to be a real, sincere religion, a sincerely held belief. So that's
Heaven
why,
forbid Americans emulate Thoreau.
right. So we're not going to bother with that. We're not granting that any legitimacy. So, but I mean, ultimately that collapses too. We do now just let people homeschool for whatever reasons they want. But the initial legal victories largely were led by this idea of religious freedom, that compulsory schooling violates my religious freedom. I want to take my kids out. And that's why it has this kind of very Christian appearance to the outside. But there are a lot of people who wanted to homeschool for other reasons too. And then, so what happens is the states, there's no national protection for homeschooling. The Supreme Court has never weighed in on the question. There's no one has argued that there's people, I'm sure the HSLDA has argued that there's a constitutional right to homeschooling, but certainly that has not been upheld by anybody. So the argument is just the state legislatures, under pressure from homeschooling advocates, have made laws that have allowed for homeschooling, and the amount of rigor, as you're describing, for what are the requirements to show that you're getting an alternative education, just varies based on the state. So Pennsylvania and New York, for example, have a relatively high bar. You have to like show your kids work every year. You have to send the curriculum that you're planning to teach your kid. You have to usually send a portfolio of work at the end of the year to show that your kid like did something. And then there are other states where you just have to tell them you're homeschooling, or states where you don't have to do anything. And that's all based on state politics. And so the history of homeschooling, I think, is a little bit more varied than we tend to think it is, because it's now
America
taken
is
on this.
pretty unique in having such open homeschooling laws.
Oh yeah, but we're very unique in
Germany,
everything about our education system is so radically decentralized, is so disparate. I mean, we have like 1,000 different kinds of schools. And that all of
in
that
Europe, I think homeschooling is effectively legal in basically every country.
It depends on the country, but I think Anglophone countries tend to be more like us in general in their development of education. I mean, it's true Canada, Britain, Australia are more like us than continental Europe and East Asia, which tend to be more centralized and also more uniform. So, I mean, homeschooling is not illegal everywhere, but it's restricted, and you would have to do a lot more than tell them that you're homeschooling that year. There's just a lot more centralization and uniformity basically everywhere in the world that is like an OECD country, where they have the kind of state capacity to develop and police a centralized school system than in the United States. The United States has just always been extremely pluralistic about education, which I think is like its great strength, and it's very hard for us to sustain. I think people don't like it. It looks ugly. They want, I mean, that's, in general, education reformers want a kind of uniformity and centralization because it allows them to track things and see that we're doing well or poorly. And it's kind of like Adam Smith describes this in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, with the man of system who just like loves to see things look nice. And he sees all of politics as a kind of like game of battleship, and you want everything to be in its right place. And they're just people who cannot tolerate the kind of disorder that decentralization and pluralism require, right? Like, it means that there's going to be schools in Tennessee that don't teach, Darwinian evolution, and there's going to be schools in, California or the Northeast that are going to teach you that there are 20 genders. And like, you just have to put up with this. Like, that's what local control results in. Right. And I think for people on both sides, it's very ugly. And
there was, I guess,
there must be some way around this.
Common Core was the recent attempt to create a national curriculum, but it foundered.
Total failed.
So it's interesting that there is a private company, the one company that does the AP tests and so on,
College Board,
that does exert a remarkable amount of control and influence on education nationally. But it's that it's a private company.
Really ironic, right? Because we don't use a lot of state centralization and uniformity. We don't impose a lot of state centralization and uniformity on education. For those students who wish to apply to a competitive college, they find that there's this private company essentially, right? Based in Princeton, New Jersey or something like, I don't actually, are they based in Princeton, or that's ETS? That just determines their fate. And all these colleges have sort of outsourced to it the work of standardization, and because there is no other standardizing
who runs that company? Who
runs College Board?
There should be more curiosity about them, given the huge influence on American life. Like, there's that one guy who was the Common Core guy. I don't remember his name.
Well, Common Core wasn't made by College Board.
But there was one guy who both did Common Core, and then he went over to College Board and remade the SAT. They do the SAT test too, don't they?
Yeah, they do SAT and AP exams.
Yeah,
and ACT is a different company.
Okay. Anyway, it's just wild to me that this one company.
But I mean, it seems so outsized, I think, to us, because we participated in this elite educational apparatus that it does the standardization for. But
I never took the SAT though.
Okay. But you went to, you've encountered people who have.
Yes, I have.
But I think for a lot of people, it actually has no effect on them. Like, it's a totally opt-in system. You don't have to apply to these elite schools. You don't have to take the SAT. You don't have to take an AP test. That's for sure. And so it's not that, I mean, it's bizarre that it's kind of our only major national standardizer, because we don't have any other national standards. But it's also an opt-in system for just a subset of high school students who are looking to get into some, but not all, colleges that are available to them. But yeah, I mean, Common Core, if, I read some of those standards, like they seem quite reasonable, but states don't like it. States don't like to be dictated to. I mean, there's this kind of grassroots resistance to educational centralization in the United States that has sort of always been there. It used to be like the Jacksonian Democrats in the 19th century, right? And then it was people who were sort of opposed to progressive technocracy. And then, I mean, it switches who it is who's doing the resisting. But there's been a kind of long-term undercurrent of resistance to this kind of uniformity and centralization in American education that just has not existed in Europe, because in Europe, they built these educational systems in the late 19th century, these school systems, and they wanted them to be centralized because they wanted them to get going immediately. And they were in a way coming from behind, like in France and in Prussia, because Americans had already had common schools for a while. They were like, not very uniform and effective, but they were there. And, American literacy at the time of the American Revolution or at the turn of the 18th century was, I think, higher than anywhere in Europe. So in a way, America was ahead, but they were ahead in a way that didn't look very effective. And for these European, especially imperial powers that are trying to develop themselves into empires in the late 19th century, universal education becomes a kind of state-controlled mechanism to do that. And there's a lot of urgency to centralize, make it uniform, and make it effective immediately because they're coming in from a disadvantage.
Have you read Eva Brand's The Paradoxes of Education, of Liberal Education in a Republic? I might be messing up the title a little bit.
No, I've never read anything by her.
So it's a fascinating book. I think you'd appreciate, but one of the things that's striking about the book is how all of the supposedly contemporary education debates were happening in almost the same terms sometimes in early America.
Yeah, I mean,
the battle lines are kind of
okay. So like classics versus modern learning. That's been a debate since the 17th century. I mean, even before America, people are having, Locke is saying like, well, should we really be teaching our kids Latin and Greek? Like, what is the purpose of that, right? That's not really a functional knowledge. Maybe we should start with French. That's functional knowledge, right? So that debate is extremely old. And if you extrapolate that to a sort of larger debate about like the classics, not just Greek and Latin, but like classic texts or the great books or something like that, versus like modern training, job training or something like that. Yeah, that's already happening in the 1780s and 1790s. People are having this debate. Benjamin Franklin starts an academy in Philadelphia. Well, you know about this because eventually it becomes the University of Pennsylvania. And he's debating.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I was going to say, and
so
then
he's
Jefferson
debating like
in Virginia.
Curriculum. Yeah. So, but for the academy, which is like Deerfield, right? It's like one of these like private schools, but there's no public schools. So it's kind of like a community school that you have to pay tuition for. He's, arguing, well, what should the curriculum be for this? And he ends up coming up with parallel curricula, one which he calls the English school and one which he calls like the Latin school or the grammar school. And the grammar school is like the elevated one where we're going to teach you Latin and Greek. And like, he thinks, well, maybe like rich people will care about that for their children. But we really need to have, what we really need is an English school where we teach people how to write in English. And we teach them like rhetoric and we teach them English grammar and we teach them how to do accounting. And that's going to be really important for people who are middle class and are going to go into the professions, right? And they're not the learned professions. They're not going to go on to the university. So already, I mean, that's like, the 1740s and 1750s where he's having these arguments. So yeah, these arguments are super old about relevance versus, timelessness and things like that. I think the new argument in the 20th century is about what is the power of the state versus the parents. Because, communities had power in New England in the 18th century. So you could fine parents for not educating their children in New England because there are these town laws requiring education. And part of what those town laws do is set up schools, or at least say that they're going to set up schools. But they also give to parents the responsibility of teaching their children to read and educating them. And if they feel that if the town feels that the parents are neglecting that responsibility, they can fine them. So there is that kind of power, but that's totally local, right? Like Massachusetts Bay is not going to do that. The state of Massachusetts is not going to do that. It's in the 20th century with progressive reforms in compulsory education that require everybody to go to school. And other things that progressives are engaged in, like juvenile delinquency and things like that, that start to raise this question about, well, if the parents are not doing a good job, can the state step in? and what is the responsibility of the state to step in and compensate for bad parenting. And so I think that is a fairly new 20th century debate. And that's, I think, where the tension comes in today with a lot of people who are opposed to homeschooling, right? The opposition to homeschooling. So one side of it is like, oh, your child is going to be like socially malformed or something and too weird. But like, I think, you know, as more and more kids who are homeschooled go to the university, go into public life, like you will see that in fact, schools also maybe, you know, distort the socialization of your children in other different ways that we hadn't thought about. But the other set of arguments against homeschooling, and I think I mentioned this in 2020 because this came up as a kind of cause celeb for a little bit in the homeschooling community, was this idea that if we allow you to teach your own children, it opens the possibility for abuse and indoctrination. And the only possible countervailing power to that would be the state. And so shouldn't the state have, at the very least, a right to investigate what you're doing, right, to surveil what you're doing, and ideally, just to prevent you from doing that, we're going to make sure that all children get an equal education. So I think that debate we don't see so much of before the 20th century.
What do you think of Arendt's Little Rock essay?
Yeah, it was very controversial. What do I think of it? I mean, I think she makes an interesting point. She is in a way historically correct, right? So her argument in the Little Rock essay is that using school desegregation as the kind of first go of the civil rights movement, that what the civil rights movement had done was to prioritize school desegregation and make it the first thing that they fought for. So, you know, you get this decision in Brown v. Board before you get other kinds of desegregation, like desegregation in public, you know, accommodations and things like that. She says that that was a mistake because you're thrusting children into sort of the political sphere when they're not prepared for it, and that it's not going to work because school is a fundamentally non-political kind of situation or circumstance for children, right? So she's not saying like schools are not run by the government. I mean, they're obviously public schools are run by the government, but that the way the child experiences the school, they experience it as part of the social sphere and not the political sphere. And it's a kind of extension of the home into the community. And so if you enforce desegregation on the unwilling in the schools, what you're going to do is damage children, because what's going to happen is you can't, I mean, her argument is you can't really make desegregation happen by force, because you can,
like desegregation of schools. So we have Little Rock is desegregated at the end of a bayonet, literally. And then throughout maybe the busing movement in the 70s. So it was a huge amount of state power essentially was exerted towards this end. And now it never really happened. Like schools today are very segregated, and no one seems to talk about desegregating schools anymore.
Well, Nicole Hannah Jones does.
Oh, but it's no longer a cause célèbre. No, it's never on the list of major social ills that need to be righted that I see, and no one seems particularly offended by it.
Well, I think
that's a massive way,
right. Right. I mean, what she was arguing, so I think she was criticized for saying like, look, Black people don't understand how to like fight the civil rights movement. They don't like know what's good for them, which in a way is kind of what this essay sounds like. So obviously there were a lot of critics saying like, well, you don't really know what Black people know, right? And who are you to tell us what we're supposed to do with our children? And our children are subjected to racism all the time. And so this is really no different. So, I mean, I think some of those criticisms, to the degree that they're, you know, well taken, that may be, but I think she's right about this basic point, which is that the government can force the school to be desegregated, right? She accepts that, like it's physically possible. But what's going to happen inside that school once like it's desegregated by force, right? Is anybody going to be nice to the Black kids? Is anybody going to treat them fairly? Is anybody going to take them seriously? They're not. That's what she means by the social. This is part of the social sphere, and it's not the public, right? So these Black kids who are being put into these desegregated schools are going to have a terrible education, and they're going to be neglected and abused because nobody wants them there. And so in order to get them to have to get the result, the real result of desegregation, which is like full and fair schooling for all kids, you have to first change the minds of the kids and the teachers in those schools. And that has to happen through political efforts, right? So that's why Arendt thinks you should desegregate public accommodations first. You should have like blacks and whites living together and working together so that the racial prejudice, which is going to cause the black kids in desegregated schools to be abused by the white majority, goes away first. So that when you send the black kids to those schools, they actually will be treated well. And that's what desegregation ultimately, I mean, that's what integration is, right? It's not forced desegregation, but it's a kind of mixing, you know, voluntary and desired mixing where everybody gets treated the same. So that's what she thought was going to happen, is that if you start with the schools are in this strange social position where they're kind of an extension of the home and the prejudices of the home. So these kids who are like, you know, in the picture with the girl who's going to Little Rock school, right? And everybody's like jeering at her, right? Where did those kids get that idea? Like they got it from their parents. They're not old enough to form a counter idea yet, right? And they're not going to in the school, right, where they are. So you have to wait until they develop a kind of non-racist view until you can put her kids and their kids in a school together, right? So that's what she's arguing. And she basically was right in the sense that desegregation didn't succeed, right, except in a few places where there was already this voluntary goodwill on both sides. And that was like not that many places. And so, you know, busing ends up being a kind of disaster. There's all of these riots against it. The Supreme Court finally invalidates it, I think in 72 in Milliken v. Bradley. And yeah, it just doesn't work because there's this social hostility underlying it that makes it impossible, no matter what the law says, right? And that's what Arendt was trying to distinguish, I think, in that essay, right? That this underlying social hostility is it's not influenced exactly by changing the law. Or it might trickle down to changing social attitudes, but it's going to take a while and you don't start there. So I mean, I think she's right about that. She ended up being sort of historically vindicated. And I don't know, people are upset about, I think, de facto segregation. And I think you do see a kind of desire to address it, especially on the left in education reform, by this push to get rid of SAT testing, to get rid of grading, and various forms of sort of accountability. Right.
But isn't that all for higher education? It's fascinating to me that there's a huge push for diversity in higher education, but relatively little concern for K through 12. Anyway,
well, no, I
it's
mean,
fascinating to me that it's like
testing.
that people have sort of given up on K through 12 in a way, but that because colleges have a aren't just at the mercy of who lives there, but have a selective process, that is the great, you know, that colleges are able to orchestrate it.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just easier. But
well, that's long been a goal. Yeah, I mean, that's since Backy, sort of, you know, the Supreme Court says like, well, this is the place where everyone will come together and they will learn toleration. And that's why we have to bring in, you know, racial minorities and give them these kinds of additional advantages and admissions, because it's for the sake of the diversity of the student body. So then the white students benefit by being in proximity to the Black students, which, you know, many Black scholars have pointed out is kind of patronizing. But yeah, no, I think there is stuff. I mean, it's a kind of similar, you're right, it's a defeatist attitude, but it's going on in K through 12 too, right? So like, for example, California is dropping. So instead of saying like, well, we're going to try to get everybody to do algebra in 8th grade, they say like, we're just not going to have algebra in 8th grade, right? Or we're going to just drop the advanced math classes from high school. And we're going to sort of lower the standards for everybody, right? And that way more people will meet the bar, right? You lower the bar and more people can get over it. And that is a kind of defeatist attitude. I mean, I think, you know, the NCLB, the No Child Left Behind attitude of we can have continual improvement forever and ever was like not very realistic, mathematically challenged a little bit. And so now there's a kind of reaction to that, which is that we can have, you know, why are we pressuring students to learn all this stuff anyway? You know, shouldn't we like relax? There's all this, you know, there's a mental health crisis and everybody's too stressed out. Shouldn't we just like relax and lower the stakes for everybody? And so we're going to take out the advanced classes, right? We're going to remove the advanced tracks from the high schools, and we're going to put everybody sort of more on a level, and then more people will achieve. And I think that's a kind of indirect way of getting back to the question of racial segregation and racial achievement gaps without saying that part out loud.
And I think that part of that is an unspoken um, reaction against, especially in California, public schools or high achieving public schools becoming increasingly Asian.
Yeah, I mean,
I
the
think
Asian
that there's a
factor is
move,
a complicating factor in all of this.
and I think that in higher education too. And now it's coming to the fore a little bit more with these cases, Supreme Court cases, where it's now out in the open, but that it was implicit for a long time. Okay, so
Yeah,
let's look at you. Let's talk about you.
let's talk
You
about me.
defended homeschooling in your
I have.
article. Uh, bringing back the memory of Locke and Rousseau's arguments, and it's always fascinating to me that many self-styled critics or opponents of liberalism end up reproducing the arguments of the great philosophers of liberalism. But that's a conversation for another day. Uh, but you defended homeschooling, described really clearly this problem of the tyranny of the majority in schools, that young people are at the mercy of their peers, that's the real danger, even more than the tyranny of teachers or administrators, and that the family gets to create its own culture, that homeschooling really allows that to happen, to save our children from uh save our children basically from the tyranny of their peers. But you don't homeschool, so I'm curious how the like how you arrive at those two things, like why you put your children at the mercy of the tyranny of fashion.
Yeah, well, so my kids go to a religious school, and I could not teach them the things that this religious school teaches them because I don't know enough Hebrew. So, I mean, for us, a lot of this comes down to, we moved to Houston, and Houston has a very large Jewish community. We had moved from a small town in Virginia, basically, that had not a very large Jewish community, and there's like really good Jewish educational options here, so we're going to take advantage of them while we're here. But in general, I mean, I'm not opposed to schools. So I think, I made this argument in this essay and in my book. This is, Locke's and Rousseau's argument about the dangers of schooling. But as I said before, like the problem is they don't translate that well to America, because what they're talking about is a kind of landed gentry, right, that can like take their kids to a country estate and not work and just live off the rents of the land, right, and then devote themselves to teaching their kids. It's not really a scalable model for a democracy. And so, it was interesting in the pandemic that everybody was suddenly forced into it. And they didn't really like it. Like the general tenor of the responses was like, it's horrible. I hate being at home with my children all the time. They're so annoying and they're fighting with each other. So I mean, homeschooling did actually go up after it went down right after the pandemic because people were forcibly homeschooling at that point, right? But once schools reopened, the numbers of homeschoolers stayed higher than they were before the pandemic, but not as high as in 2020 because that was like an artificial situation. So, I mean, I think homeschooling is worth defending. I think that's like the key thing, is that homeschooling is kind of embattled in the United States. I mean, people think it's either weird or nefarious. And I mean, I'm opposed to those characterizations. But basically, I think that the American education system, what works for the United States, what has worked, is educational pluralism, and that we should defend the variety of options, and not just defend one kind of educational option, because that's not really what has worked in the United States in the past. And we have developed a kind of pluralism that's very effective for us, that allows us to have a lot of community control over education without having to like actually devote ourselves full time to teaching our kids, which I think would just be too hard for most people. And the results would be kind of bad if we forced everybody into it. So my defense of homeschooling is not that it's necessarily the best education for every child. But I think we need to recover these arguments about why institutional schooling actually is bad, because we have totally forgotten them. And I think, for most Americans, when you say the word education, they immediately think school. There is like no other kind of paradigm for them to think through education than some kind of institutional school. And that's a mistake that I think we need to kind of get past. And we need to think of education as something more broad than institutional schooling, but not that every single person should be homeschooled, because actually then we might lose out on a common culture or sets of local common cultures that are actually kind of important for a fractured society like ours. So what I would defend as a matter of principle is not that homeschooling is the best form, but that we should allow homeschooling for the people who want it, who are really invested in it, who feel like they have something to teach their children, and that they're going to do a good job at it. And we should also defend a variety of different kinds of private schools, religious schools, and that public schools shouldn't have a monopoly. And within public schools, I think it's fine to have a kind of variety there too. You have the magnet schools, you have various specialized schools and things like that. All of that I think is fine and salutary. So I don't know that I would be great at homeschooling my kids. I think it'd be fine up to a certain point. But I don't know that I would have the time to do a good job. Both my husband and I work. And I understand that homeschooling also doesn't require, one of the advantages is it doesn't take as much time as a regular school day, because you can get rid of all the time wasting stuff of like line up to go to the bathroom, line up to go to your gym class, etc. But for us, I think it'd be difficult to manage at this point. And I would like my kids to get this kind of religious education that they're getting. So, and we might, it might not, we're not committed to it for life. That's the other thing, is I think that when you have kind of more options and you have a pluralistic educational system, a lot of people that I know did not just attend one school for their whole life, right? People move around, they go from public to private school. Sometimes families say like, well, we'll put you in public school until like middle school, and then we're going to put you in the Catholic school or something like that. Then that's when it's going to matter. And I think all of that is very salutary, so that you end up forming people with quite different experiences, instead of forming kind of, one uniform type of person. So that would be my defense, is that really I think that pluralism is the important thing. And so defending homeschooling is part of defending pluralism.
So you and I have the common experience of having had Leon Kass as a teacher. And a remarkable teacher in many ways. You had him as a teacher a lot longer than I did, I think.
Actually, no, I took one class with him in college.
Okay. Well, yeah, I only took one. I took one class, just a summer class with him. But he's a good example of sort of of authority in the classroom.
Oh yeah,
I think, and of so could you describe briefly for people what the experience of being in a class with Leon Kass is like? And you brought up the problem of authority earlier in terms of parents and children. I think the authority is always an interesting problem in education, in schools too. And maybe we just wrap up with this question of authority is really fascinating to me, but with Kass as an example of what authority looks like ably demonstrated.
Yeah. That experience of taking that class actually was a lot of my concrete, it was like the sort of crystallization of what I was thinking of when I was writing my dissertation in graduate school, which then became my book, about like, what could pedagogical authority look like under liberal and democratic conditions where like everything really militates against it. Because it's true, like, Leon Kass, you just like, what would happen, so I took a class with him on the book of Exodus. He would like come into class and he was always wearing like a suit jacket, and he would take off the suit jacket and put it on the back of his chair, and then he would like roll up his sleeves. And like, it was like a normal thing to do, more or less. There's nothing remarkable about it. But within like 3 or 4 weeks of this class, all the men in the class would come in with suit jackets and they would start doing exactly the same thing. And this was like the University of Chicago in 2007, and people are not really walking around in suit jackets like to go to class. This was, they were like, they kind of dressed up because he sort of set the tone and he elevated it so high, and people just kind of lived up to it. He would also call people by, Mr. and Miss by your last name. And it was very effective. People felt like, he was a really interesting combination. He was not authoritarian, right? He doesn't lecture. He doesn't tell you like, this is the reading of the text, right? He gets everything out of the students, but he somehow makes them feel like whatever they're talking, it's like they're saying the most important thing in the world. And, he has a way he has like mannerisms, right? So he'd be like, you'd say a little bit and he'd be like, say some more, Mr. Antenin, right?
Yeah,
Tell
I
me a
remember
little
him.
more.
He'd go,
and then you were like, I
very
know
nice.
what I was saying.
Very nice.
Yeah.
More.
And then, like very, very minimal approval that like meant a lot. It was like, oh, that's very nice. And you'd be like, yes. So he had a way, he just had charisma, right? I think that's what I sort of ultimately boiled it down to, is that his authority is charismatic authority. And Weber talks about this, and charismatic authority is ambivalent, right? For liberalism, because like all kinds of people can have charisma and not all of them are good. So we would say in this case, like Leon Kass had, salutary charisma that got all of his students to like really be so invested in the text, be so invested in the course. You would like rack your brain to try to think of like the most intelligent thing that you could say. And you would never do the sort of stuff that, in, other classes where things would degenerate, discussion would degenerate. You would like insult other people, or at least like kind of diminish them in your response. Or, you would be sort of like, it was very casual. I would say like a lot. I was one of the people who had this problem. But whenever you spoke in Mr. Cass's class, you would try very hard to control your oratory so that it would come off as sophisticated and intelligent as possible, right? And you would, you're trying to impress him in a way, but the result of trying to impress him is that you're in fact elevating your own thinking and reading far beyond what it would be if you were just like, well, I've got to go to a class and say something, halfway decent. Yeah. So, it's hard to boil, like, what did he do? I can't replicate it when I teach. Like, I just don't have this kind of charisma. He just had charisma. And it was like a very particular kind of like, it wasn't political charisma. Like, I don't think that if he gave, a stump speech that people would be like all that impressed. I don't know if you agree. I don't know that like what he had translates even.
I find his bioethics lectures compelling. Like when he's laying
but like
out,
as
like,
an
okay,
academic.
yeah, but he's laying out, okay, this is because he had that was his political action, is that he was on
He was the chairman,
bioethics
the President's Council on
committee.
Bioethics.
The reverberations of that are fascinating, by the way. If you look at who sort of his younger people who were he had working.
I was an intern.
You were an intern, but if you look at like
I was an intern.
Sigma Foundation is sort of comes out of that. All these different things come
That's
out
right, yeah.
of Cass's bioethics committee, and none of which seem to really have much to do with bioethics. It's kind of interesting. But anyway, I find he gave speeches and lectures around that I find compelling, but I also had already had him as a teacher. And so I would probably find
but
him
do you think
about anything compelling.
Do you think he'd be like compelling as a politician though?
Oh no, that's not
right. So that's what I mean by like giving a stump speech.
Yeah.
So like Weber, when he talks about charismatic authority, is largely
a small town
political
mayor
terms.
Yeah, maybe I could see him as a small town mayor, maybe.
Okay. But it's hard to see him as like a Ron DeSantis, right? Or like a kind of national level political figure.
Sure. Yeah.
So, that's what I think is really fascinating. Is like Weber, when he talks about charismatic authority, is like thinking of political, this kind of the charisma of the politician who's able to like move a crowd. And like, I don't think that Leon Kass has that kind of charisma at all.
No.
But he had this other kind of charisma, which is pedagogical charisma. Like he's just really good at teaching. I think he could like walk into any seminar. When he did these summer seminars, it wasn't like he knew you guys, he would sometimes like drop in for one thing and he could just like make it work. And this is like a really fascinating phenomenon to me, because ultimately like political authority is significant, but I'm really interested in pedagogical authority and what it takes to persuade people to learn, which I don't think is wholly rational. And I don't think is like something that you can just like learn strategy for, you know, like that they teach you in education school. Like this is how you teach a course, like science, the science of pedagogy, right, says you should do these things. I think Weber's right that charisma is a kind of half irrational passion that people have for somebody, right? Or a kind of irrational power or influence that people can exert that can't really be systematized. And yeah, I mean, Leon Cass was really good. And everybody, if you talk to people, you know, think of the one teacher that you had who was really good, like people who didn't have Leon Cass as a teacher. Most people have one or two people like this in their background, right? You know, you have probably 30, 40 teachers between kindergarten and college, maybe more if you really go to college and do a lot of stuff there. And most people can only think of one or two who are really influential, but
And
then
it's
they
really
credit those one
tenuous.
or two.
It's
Yeah.
tenuous. Like
But
I had a professor in college who was very learned and compelling, but I saw him ride by on a little motorized scooter once, and his entire authority collapsed instantly.
yeah, okay.
I
So
mean,
I saw when I saw my professors working out at the gym in college, I had a similar experience. I like saw them, they were all like sweaty and gross, and I was like, no.
and so it's really tenuous. It's easy, just I don't know. It's sort of play acting or something. Yeah, it's like
Yeah, it is a performance. I think it's a performance. It's hard to keep it on all the time. So like your professor was like riding his moped, he probably didn't think you were around, right? You're allowed to like let loose sometimes,
oh,
but
he
hopefully
waved
not.
to me, and that was that. Even it really, it was. Yeah, I feel bad saying. I'm not going to say his name, but it was uh and it was so I saw Cass give a lecture at St. John's College some years ago, and after lectures at St. John's College there's a question period where everyone you there's the lecture and then you go into a separate room and it's a conversation. And it was funny because so Cass has a long history with St. John's College. He's close friends with the Flaumenhoffs, who were longtime
Mhm.
tutors there. And so he, not literally, but basically, kind of kicked his shoes off and was being really casual in a way that wasn't true in class. And it was fascinating because he was, essentially like having a conversation and joking with friends. But nonetheless,
Yeah.
that authority was still there.
Yeah, well, you got to
But it
maybe
was interesting
part.
to see a different, even in a different context of more playful. But was I mean, I hesitant to even ask this question, but so he was talking about Exodus actually. This is before his book came out, but was not clear to me is whether he actually believed any of it. And I guess this is the real question with Cass and with that wider sphere that he's part of. He's not really a Straussian, but he's adjacent, of whether or not, he gives this whole lovely lecture about the divine law and politics and the necessity of, I mean, my memory of his class, he had this really dark view of basically like we're all sliding towards this abyss of incest and immorality, and we had to build a wall uh to prevent the slide into the abyss. Anyway, like a wall of morality. But it was unclear as like whether any particular morality would do, like whether truth actually was any part of it, whether it could be, oh, we could be Baptists, we could be Orthodox Jews, we could be Muslims, as long as we have a moral system. It seems sort of totally arbitrary of like which one it was, to some degree, as long as it had these basic tenets. I don't know if that
Yeah.
you ever
Yeah.
got an
Well, you're
impression
going
along
to
those
have to do a
lines.
different podcast with me on Straussianism, but it's going to
Okay.
have to be secret. Can't can't have a public.
That's a good answer. Okay. Well, thank you
Uh,
so much for joining me today. We'll leave that one on. You have to go back and listen to this, listeners out there, a few times to read between the lines of all the previous answers to know the answer to the final question.
that's right.
Okay, thank you, Rita.
Yep. Thanks for having me.